Doc, we better back up. We don't have enough road to get up to 88.
Roads? Where we're going, we don't need roads.
You're listening to CJLO 1690 AM in Montreal, and this is The Worlds We Want, a podcast powered by Future Earth. I'm Tristan Mason.
I'm Cheryl Gladue.
And it's February 28th. This is episode 5. Today we're talking about the future.
Unfortunately, our co-host Joel isn't with us today as he's very much focused on the present and making his way through a mountain of other work. He'll come back to us when that mountain is back to being a molehill.
When you think about the future, what comes to mind? Assuming that something comes to mind, what do you suppose inspired those thoughts?
Welcome to another edition of Thunderdome!
Open the pod bay doors, Hal.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
42. 42?
Many of us are likely familiar with personal goal setting. We're just 2 months into the new year. Some of you are probably shuffling through the papers on your desk, wondering where your New Year's resolutions went to. Either way, you're likely all too aware that in order to accomplish great things, it's good practice to clearly imagine or visualize what life might be like if you were to realize those dreams. Doing this allows you to get a feel for what it might be like to have accomplished those goals, and possibly giving you a better understanding of what's needed to make it there.
Regardless of your personal goal-setting practices, if your experiences are anything like ours, you know that things rarely just turn out well without some thought, planning, luck, or effort. What then of our future? Yours and mine. How do we, as a society, think about the future? How do we think about the future becoming better for more people? How might we think, plan, and work towards the kind of worlds we want, rather than just the kind of worlds that we stumble upon?
Well, on today's show, we've talked to some people who wake up to these kinds of questions every day. We'll start with a conversation that we had one afternoon last week in an unusually warm boardroom in downtown Montreal.
Tristan.
Will now be placed into the conference.
We joined a conference call with a few folks working at Policy Horizons. Namely,
hi, I'm Marcus Ballinger. I'm Acting Director of Strategic Foresight here at Policy Horizons.
And
my name is Pierre-Olivier Desmarchais. I'm a policy researcher at Horizons.
Policy Horizons, or simply Horizons, started a few years ago and was initially called the Policy Research Initiative. In the last 3 or 4 years, the group has increased its focus on strategic foresight research. Marcus will explain.
Well, Policy Horizons is a federal government think tank, and what we think about is the future. And more specifically, we think about a range of plausible alternate futures. One of the things that we're trying to do is explore the low probability but high impact changes that could come about for which we might find current policy and programming to be challenged. So in the world of policy, and in most people's worlds, just everyday human life, we have an expected future. And we make a lot of our decisions around that expected future. And the expected future is often informed by a set of assumptions. Organizations and sub-organizations within larger organizations aren't really that different in many ways. They often operate from a sometimes underappreciated but very potent set of assumptions about the expected future. And so a lot of what they do is based on this core set of assumptions. The policy and the program that they develop is based around an expected future. And it's important to do that. I mean, you look kind of silly if something that was obvious and really high probability came to pass and you weren't ready for it. But what we're trying to do is explore those kind of edge cases where we see the beginning of something, weak signals of change, particularly in a larger system. And based on our analysis and collecting through scanning a number of these weak signals, we sometimes generate something we call an insight, which is a sense that something significant could be changing in this underlying system. So it might be a social system, it might be the economy, it might be the environment or the energy system, for example. And then we play with those, and we try and push them out into the future 10 years as much as possible. and see what sort of worlds, alternate plausible worlds, might emerge from those. And then we take the assumptions that we've see people using to develop policy, and we kind of test them against those alternate plausible futures and say, well, is this a good assumption to use in this plausible scenario? If this were actually to come to be, would the assumptions be robust ones? And if they're not, maybe we should rethink what those assumptions are. And so we do that across a range of scenarios. At the end of the day, what we're trying to do is give people an idea of what alternate plausible futures could look like so that they're perhaps better prepared for them if they do actually come along, and also to really test the assumptions and the mental models that people are using to make their decisions now so that we can ultimately get better outcomes in the future.
Their mandate includes doing foresight, but also
developing the capacity within the government for people to do foresight, so expanding the reach that we have by training other people how to do it. But another important thing that we do is something we call foresight literacy, and that's getting people to understand what a foresight study is and how it's different from forecasting. So forecasting is the type of work where you take data from the past and you project it forward into the future, and that is really the expected future, based on an assumption that the future will be very much like the past, or that if there's any changes, the variability comes from changes in known variables. Whereas with foresight, what we're looking at is an underlying shift in the system. So you're looking for changes that are not expected. And so it's important for us to work with people to make sure that they understand the distinction between the two, so that when they get a foresight study, they actually know what they're looking at and how it's useful to them in their program area.
Could you, just for sake of clarification, talk about an example of one of these weak signals of change that you develop these insight papers around?
So at Policy Horizons, actually we have an all-analyst meeting every Friday morning. We call it the Friday Scanning morning. It's a session where every analyst and researcher are coming together and sharing their weak signal, which are actually signs of change, or what I would call a kind of innovation. We can, of course, think about technological innovation, but also social, economic, or governance innovation. And, I will share with you one of my weak signals from, I think it was 3 weeks ago, and I think it's related with sustainable development, but it's the WWF with actually testing and implementing using blockchain, right? With the in the Pacifics with the fisheries industries. So they are their main objective is they would like to track tuna from every step of the supply chain and share this information with the consumers. That's an example of a weak signal that we are sharing it. And usually the way that we are sharing a weak signal is a description, right, of the signs of change, so the innovation. But we are also having a discussion on what could be the potential implication, right? And when we are looking at implication, we're looking at social, economic, environment, technology, governance implication. And this helps us to evaluate what's the surprising or unsuspected implication of a technology.
So did you come up with some sort of conclusions in terms of what might be a surprising outcome of tracking tuna to the consumers?
Well, I think blockchain is blockchain as well as Internet of Things and all these kind of tracking technology sensors, right? It could unveil the supply chain, right, and the value chain of different products. So it comes with challenge and opportunity. Of course, I mean, we certainly have the opportunity to unveil this to the consumers. Maybe the challenge is how do we agree on a standardized matrix, right, to share this information, but also what kind of information we want to track for each product. And then, I mean, we from a sustainability point of view, we just for example, if there's two different products, right, but for the same purpose, There's one that is taking more energy, and the other one is taking more water, right? So how do you share this information with the consumer? It might be a kind of challenge. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, for Canada, the implication is, what if, for example, we unveil the Canadian supply chain because we're using these kind of emerging technology, or third party are doing it, right? So what could be the implication for Canada?
Great. So one of the things that I noticed and that immediately kind of struck my attention when I was looking up policy horizons is this idea of futurism. And it's not one that I'm familiar with. So I was hoping, could you tell us a little bit about what futurism is?
Sure. Well, futurism is a field of study. A lot of people think that the future is really unknown. And so sometimes people will just say, well, we don't know what the future will be with any certainty, so we're just going to give up and we're just going to let it happen as it does. I think that's not correct. I think we actually have a fair amount of determination about what the future is by making the appropriate decisions. So what we can say with certainty is that the future will be likely very different. To what degree it will be different, where it will be different, and on what timeline it will be different is something that's up for discussion and debate, depending on who you're working with. But the core is that it will be different, and there are choices that we can make that either a better future or a worse future. So the core, the key idea is that you can actually shape the future to a certain degree, and you do that by understanding that, as I was saying earlier, the range of plausible futures. If you're better prepared for it by having explored what the range of plausible futures is, then you are in a better position to make decisions because you know what the consequences might be. You have a better sense of both the opportunities and the challenges. So the future, some people, we see a lot of people who are into the doom and gloom side of the future.
We'll send you to the colonies. You'll be cleaning up toxic waste, and then you'll die.
But we also see that there's a potentially very bright future as well. It could also be that it's bright and dark at different times and different places for different people. But to say that there's only one future and that the future will just come and there's not much we can do about it is something that we generally don't agree with here. We think that we do have the opportunity to explore the future in a meaningful way and to make strategic policy decisions as a result of that will lead to better outcomes. We all use mental models to make decisions every day. I mean, life would be incredibly chaotic if we didn't. So we have to make some assumptions. But the thing to do is to think about the alternate plausible outcomes. And so when you're thinking about a future, your own future, for example, you have an expected future and you plan for that. But you can also think about contingencies or other things that you could do. If I made this choice, then I would probably have this outcome. If I made this other choice, you might have a different outcome. So we play with these mental models in our head all the time. And it's that ability to create mental models, which is one of the core abilities that humans have that we play with when we're doing our particular type of strategic foresight. We have a very rigorous methodology that's been produced here by our chief futurist, a fellow named Peter Padbury, who's been in this business for decades. He's world-renowned within futurism. We often joke that if futurism was rock and roll, he'd be like Bono. We're not actually the same sort of level of fame and fortune, but if you drew the analogy, then Peter Padbury would be a name that was widely recognized within the future sphere.
I was just Googling, futurism and how it's perceived and how there's this perception that futurists sort of just miss the mark continuously. How do you guys deal with that perception?
Well, the glib answer is that we're almost always right because we don't say this will be the future.
Yeah.
We say this is the range of plausible futures, and the chances of one of them or a combination of them coming true are pretty high. Okay. The problem is when people confuse the futurism, or strategic foresight as we like to call it, with forecasting. So if you're say I'm a futurist and I'm telling you that this is the future and I'm saying that with high probability, then I think you're actually misleading people. And so we don't rely on forecasts. What we're doing is specifically saying there's a range of plausible futures. Which one will obtain, we're not sure, but by exploring those range of futures and understanding some of the weak signals that got us to believe that those are actual plausible futures, you can then start to get a better sense of which one is more likely to obtain by looking for confirming weak signals. So if you have a weak signal that says, for example, one of the weak signals that people don't believe is actually true is that there are flying taxis. So we say there's flying taxis, and people go, "What? You're crazy. There's no flying taxis." So, yeah, they're actually being tested right now in Dubai, and they will probably have a commercial flying taxi service operating in Dubai within a year.
And also it in China.
Yeah. Elon Musk does not approve this.
But he wants to go with the Hyperloop, so we could use the Hyperloop as another example. You could say, people, well, they're working on the Hyperloop now. They might actually get it to be commercially successful, and suppose you could go from Montreal to Ottawa in 19 minutes, or you could go from Toronto to Montreal in 38 minutes. How would that change your world? The type of thing that makes you have to say to people, well, how would that change where you live? How would that change how would that change property values? How would that change your tax base? And so you can start rolling out some of these what-ifs. If that actually became a thing, and there's a weak signal that says it could become a thing, how would that change your world? And you could look at it in different dimensions, as an individual, as a company, as a government, at a local or a national or a federal level, or provincial level. So once you sort of say, oh, that could actually be a thing, flying taxis or Hyperloops, yeah, that could be a thing, then you can say, how would that change your world? For us to say, yeah, Hyperloops are coming in and they're going to change this, this, and this, that's a forecast, and we don't do that.
Okay.
We just say, that's, I think, the important distinction. If someone's telling you this is the future, and I'm an expert, I'm a futurist, and I can tell you that this is going to happen, they're really talking about forecasting, and we don't do that.
I guess that's why a lot of your publications start with the phrase "what if," ... Yeah. Okay.
Exactly. So that's what we're trying to get people to think. It's like, what if this happened? Then what? What would happen? What would be the challenges and opportunities if this thing that we see a weak signal of now actually became a big thing? So in 10 years from now, say flying taxis are common. I mean, you might not get a flying taxi from downtown Montreal to the South Shore in the next year, but 5 to 10 years from now, it might be common. So you could say to yourself, well, what would that do? What would that do for commuting patterns? What would it do for infrastructure investment? What would that do for your parking revenues? There's all sorts of questions that you can start asking people about it, and then they can say, oh, well, actually, maybe we should make some choices. Maybe we should come up with some policy or some regulatory decisions so that we get the future of flying taxis that provides the most benefit for people, as opposed to another form of congestion or commuter congestion, because we hadn't thought through what the possible ramifications of that technology would be.
By way of example, Pierre-Olivier talked to us about one of his favorite research projects that really got him thinking. That is, self-driving cars as a possible replacement for mass transit in cities. He proposed a number of ways that this sort of mobility-on-demand system could lead to better urban experiences. Alternatively,
and this was part of the L scenario that one of the experts we interview on this share with us. Just imagine that you're asking to your self-driving vehicles that you own, actually, to bring you to work in the morning, and then you can, over the day, you can send your car to pick your grocery. You can send your car to do some shopping for you, or there will be those kind of ghost vehicle on the road that could certainly contribute to increased traffic or congestion, which would not be great. But on the other side, I mean, because car manufacturers are, at least since 2 years, saying that, this is what we are going, right? We want to be a major player in this mobility on demand services, because they will operate this autonomous vehicle fleet. I think that, operational cost, like fuel, just think for that. I mean, I think there's an opportunity with self-driving car, to shift to electric vehicle rapidly. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because it's going to be cheaper for them, right? I mean, cheaper in terms of maintenance, cheaper in terms of fuel. So the next step is, what kind of infrastructure, for example, do we need, right? People are, for example, we would like to have a charging station. Yeah, but are you sure what kind of charging station do we need, right? If, for example, mobility on demand systems emerge and become the new normal, right? So what kind of charging station do you need? Do you need under the roads while the vehicle is driving, right? So like that, it's all these major questions right now that I think are important to think and, start to think about it and maybe engage with the future integration of self-driving car.
Well, I think Pierre-Olivier's example points out what we were talking about earlier, this idea that you have to make some decisions about what future you want. So on the one hand, if you were to take measures to try and limit the number of personally owned autonomous vehicles in your urban centers and switch to a model based on mobility on demand where the product, a particular vehicle for your particular use shows up when you need it in relatively short order and then is transferred to somebody else once you're done with it, that could significantly reduce congestion in the cities and make the cities potentially more usable for pedestrians or other cyclists or things of that nature, free up a lot of space that would otherwise be used for parking. But on the other hand, if all of the autonomous vehicles are owned by private individuals, then, as Pierre-Olivier said, there's no opportunity cost to you personally to sending your car to go get you a coffee at the drive-thru. You could just have cars just inching around the city everywhere because they're all going to pick up dry cleaning or they're going to pick you up a coffee, and it doesn't matter to you. You'd also see a situation where, I drive my car, I get driven by my autonomous car into the city in the morning, and if parking is $10 downtown, but it only costs $9 to send my car back and forth to my suburban garage, then I'll just send it back home. So we'll just have congestion coming in and congestion coming back. But people won't care, in a sense, because they won't have the opportunity cost of actually having to pay attention to the road. They could be watching TV, they could be texting, they could be emailing or getting an hour's worth of work in. So the kind of decisions we make to either advance or impede personal mobility can make a big difference.
More recently, Pierre-Olivier has been working on an ongoing foresight research project called Scan 2030, which provides an overview of 4 broad areas, including sustainable development, infrastructure, the digital economy, and governance. We'll have links to these in the show notes. We also talked a little bit about Horizon's role in looking at how government defines prosperity and the way measurement of national well-being or success can have an impact on the environment and society. Critically, the choice of measurement sends signals to the economy and future governments about what is important to citizens and vice versa. While Marcus doesn't see gross domestic product or GDP disappearing as a metric for success in the immediate future,
it may need to be supplemented by other metrics to give a more holistic view of how the economy, but also the welfare of the citizenry is doing. So I think we will see an emergence of that. We have seen there are some metrics that are in use in other countries. The happiness index, I believe, is one of those. But I think we will see perhaps a broader suite of metrics that are brought to bear, and GDP will be just one of those. And GDP will perhaps measure specifically what it was meant to measure, which is the value of goods and services produced in the economy, and not necessarily be seen as a proxy for overall increases in welfare.
That was Pierre-Olivier Desmarchais and Marcus Ballinger of Policy Horizons Canada. You can find information about the work they do in strategic foresight, as well as links to a number of thought-provoking articles in the show notes.
Next up is our conversation with Dr. Andrew Merrie from the Stockholm Resilience Centre. We spoke with him about his project, Radical Ocean Futures, which uses science fiction prototyping and mixed media to imagine multiple futures based on emerging research into oceans.
Hi, I'm Andrew Merrie, and I recently finished my PhD at the Stockholm Resilience Centre, and now I work as part of the communications team. And the project that I'm going to be talking to you about is actually like a part of my PhD, and indeed it was the final paper. Now, radical ocean futures, at sort of when you hear it, it doesn't really say that much, but it came out of a sense of sort of frustration, I think, during my PhD. I was very privileged to be part of an interdisciplinary sort of research program that sort of had the focus on predicting the future ocean. At the Stockholm Resilience Centre, in my role, we were sort of empowered to focus on the sort of governance component of that. What, if we understand that there's going to be climate change and other kind of global environmental shifts that are going to affect the oceans, how will people respond and how do we govern a changing ocean? But obviously that's a big question. You can't really necessarily model human responses or think about the ways that humans will act in a future ocean in the same way that you can forecast changes in climate, or may be able to try to model how different species shift around the ocean and all those kinds of things. So for me, there was sort of this gap between what we knew from the best marine science and what was so sort of radically out there and so far away into the future that it wasn't connected to science at all. But I thought that, we need to sort of move beyond predicting the future ocean, because I sort of questioned even the idea that you could really predict what the future ocean was, and actually sort of try to use the scientific knowledge we had to push beyond and really explore those different kinds of questions that are raised by this idea of governing the future oceans. So that was when I started working on radical ocean futures, and I've always been a science fiction nerd right from almost before I can remember. I remember watching Aliens over the couch of my parents' house and then being absolutely terrified and having nightmares for weeks afterwards. And I'm into Star Wars and all those things, and science fiction has always been a big part of my life. But I started to think that, science fiction has a lot of power to kind of sort of tell these human stories that are able to bring together changes in ecosystems and human behavior and technology, and actually say something really interesting about the future. So then I started experimenting, and I started writing a story about this Norwegian seafood CEO who had sort of been congratulated and disdained for the successful privatization of global food security. So I started with this one idea, this narrative that often comes up in the ocean about farming the sea. And I thought, well, what happens if you sort of use the science fiction lens and kind of take that to the extreme? And so that was really the starting point. And from that, I then sort of developed 4 of these short science fiction narratives, which were all based on really good quality marine science that I had access to through being part of this NERIAS program. So they're all scientifically founded. But I used a method called science fiction prototyping to actually build these kind of science fiction stories. And that was the kind of first stage of the project. And then I realized that, okay, so writing these narratives is one entry point into the science, and it does allow us to create kind of a compelling way to answer really important questions about the future ocean that you are limited with sort of more traditional or quantitative or analytical approaches. But it wasn't enough, because I was also very conscious that the ocean is something that's really invisible to a lot of people. It's hard to get them to care about it. And so that was when I thought, it would be really great to bring an artist on board to actually bring these stories to life and really find a way so that people could look at images and really sort of have a connection, start to ask their own questions about the ocean and its future.
Yeah, and so I'm wondering, so you had the stories written, and then the artists, you have a visual artist and a musician, they were responding to those stories? Is that how that worked?
Yes, exactly. So I started, I actually written the stories, and I then sort of went to this artist, and I actually came across the artist on IO9, which is sort of a science fiction nerd blog. And they have this section on there called Fine Art, where they sort of feature concept artists and people who are doing really interesting things in film and video games from around the world. And one day I saw this, and Simon Stålenhag, who's this Swedish concept artist, came up. And I thought, I would love to work with him. He would be the perfect person to sort of help me to kind of visually articulate these stories, because he has this incredible way of bringing science fiction elements and the elements of the fantastical and the future into what are quite prosaic everyday settings. And so that means that it's very easy for people to kind of create some kind of connection, or that it triggers some memory or some emotional trigger when they see these images. And so I thought that it was the perfect way to do that. And fortunately, I was able to commission him to produce those. And that was a really, really awesome process where we spent about a month on each of the 4 stories, developing the imagery and the different ideas for how we thought we could visually conceptualize these stories. And yeah, that was an awesome experience. And he would sort of come to me with he would read the stories a few times and then come back to me with 2 or 3 possible large directions and say, okay, these are what I interpret to be the most important kind of messages or visual ideas out of the stories. Which one do you want to go with? And then I would choose one, and then we would go through a whole series of iterations. And one thing that was, I think, really powerful and I think of value to a lot of scientists who want to engage with artists or find other ways to express their work is that I would always want to add more detail, to want to clarify things, to want to add one more piece, to make sure that, oh no, but it's really important because the science says this and the story has these 3 elements, so we need to make sure all of this is in there. And he, to his credit, was very strong in his artistic vision and had a lot of kind of credibility, and he was like, no, I can do that if you want, because you've commissioned me, but it will be rubbish. It will not turn out well. Do not do this. Take out things. And so that back and forth, and me kind of wanting to add details, and him saying, like, I think for both aesthetically and also in order to create a visual that is able to have a single kind of powerful message. You have to have one takeaway that you want people to view when they look at the image to get one idea, and then they can start exploring and riffing off that and thinking about other options. But that was a really powerful realization for me in terms of, because I think that a unique experience being part of this scenario process and really trying to envision these ocean futures is that so often scientists, when they won't kind of let go of enough of themselves or be open enough to actually say, like, we don't have complete control of this. We need to work with the artists and trust them and their creative vision to create something that's genuinely visually compelling. Because often you end up with some mishmash that doesn't represent the science and it doesn't represent the artistic vision, and so you have something which doesn't create any impact at all.
Yeah, I mean, we've been talking with people about the process of engaging in transdisciplinary research, and there's this sort of co-learning that happens where you learn how somebody shares their knowledge and you share your knowledge.
Exactly.
And in art, there's a kind of ambiguity that's required to allow, you have to create space for ambiguity, and that's uncomfortable, I'd imagine, for scientists.
Yeah, exactly. You picked up on something really important there. It's dealing with ambiguity, but also realizing that, we often talk about science and art in the same breath, or art science, but even though these things are talked about together, there's an implicit hierarchy and the assumption that scientists, well, you're just the artist, you're just the one who's turning this into a picture, you haven't actually done the science, so that's not that important. And if you genuinely hold that belief, if you genuinely think that the artist is just there to make it look pretty, or to do something aesthetically with your important science, then that's never actually going to be a true transdisciplinary collaboration. You're betraying the spirit of what that is. You have to really believe and invest fully that you are equal partners and that you can learn from each other and that you can actually create something unique through each of you learning. At the same time, the artist has to be open to taking on the science. And I think that was really great with Simon, that he himself was very interested in the science and really engaged very seriously, in the stories, and asked a lot of kind of follow-up questions about the sort of science that was behind the ideas, and really engaged in understanding the science and bringing that into the way that he drew. And then I hoped that I was able to sort of then respect his artistic integrity when he came back to me and said, because we had occasions where I would sort of push to him and say, this is something that's really, really important. I don't want to compromise on this. And he would also come back and say, look, in order for me to do my best work, in order for me to invest myself artistically in this fully and make sure that this is not something that I'm doing just for you as a client, it's something that I'm doing as a piece of art in its own right. This is my non-negotiable, or what I think is important. And you have to sort of negotiate and find those boundaries, I think, for working in this sort of, as you say, uncomfortable space between science and art.
Andrew spoke to us about his experience working with Kay La Luna, the musical alter ego of Dr. Caitlin Rothwell, on the musical component of the project.
I am a warrior, our island survival, with grace has revived us.
And what's interesting about Caitlin, which is very different to Simon, is that Caitlin did her PhD in resilience thinking and complexity, and she worked with the way that indigenous communities in the Arctic were using art in order to kind of engage with and address issues around climate change and how they were adapting. So she was an artist and also a scientist, and so that was kind of an interesting engagement that we had, where we would sort of switch between engaging as scientists and engaging as artists. And where her artistic practice comes in is, as Kay La Luna, she's really interested in kind of translating ideas of complexity and sustainability science and, you know, these sort of linked social and ecological systems into music. So with her, she sort of would have this approach as she would sort of really engage quite deeply with the science that was behind the stories, and then think about how that would translate into musical beats or sort of notes. So she would, if in one story there was something about a certain kind of looming slow sea level rise or some other kind of Earth system change, she would sort of try to reflect that in the way that she chose this specific musical note or the sort of part of the song. At the same time, because these were science fiction stories, she was also engaging with the character and the world building and the aspects of the narrative. So it was this really interesting case where there was sort of this blend between engaging with the science that sat behind the stories and then the actual how do you create music that's also appropriate to the narrative and the character and the different aspects of the stories. So I thought that was a super interesting experience with working with her. The similarity, of course, is that she also has her strong integrity and credibility as an artist, and so there were times as well where, I might make a session, or maybe in my own head I had a different idea about how it would sound. But she came to that through a creative process, so you also need to accept that, you might have different ways of how you would expect things to play out, but both are equally valid. And the artist kind of needs to be, it's not a transactional relationship. You can't force them to kind of do what you would expect. You have to be open to things sounding different in this case, or looking different, or feeling different.
Embedded within the fictional stories are links, much like you might find in a blog or wiki post. These links point to current and past events that lend a non-fictional foundation for these stories to build upon. When you read these stories, you get exposed to many of the current changes that are taking place in the world's ocean, whether it be seasteaders that are making permanent settlements on the water, or a rogue experiment that led to millions of tons of iron filings being dumped into the Pacific Ocean just off the coast of Haida Gwaii. These stories remind us of the notion that Marcus and Pierre-Olivier told us about, namely weak signals that might point to a change in our future ways of living.
During my PhD, one of the things is I was actually looking at writing a paper where I would sort of assess the history of the last 20 years of marine science to see how it had changed, like what were the trends what were the different kinds of issues that we're addressing, how are they dealing with like cumulative pressures on the ocean, were they kind of dealing with people at all? And so I had at my sort of fingertips as a starting point for this project, this really, really robust kind of in a spreadsheet, essentially, of 200 or 300 marine science papers, which sort of gave me the foundation, because I'd read all those papers and I knew kind of what they, I sort of had this kind of overview of the different trends and things that came out of them. So that was kind of my foundation where I started. And that was really, really useful, because then I knew, like, okay, out of these papers, what things are coming up kind of time and time again as stuff that is likely to be kind of a valid point for thinking about future change in sort of ecosystems or climate or other things. So it wasn't like I was taking one thing and then like extremely extrapolating from that. So I had a really good scientific base. And out of doing that project, that was also another kind of source of inspiration, because I'd read about jellyfish deserts. I'd read about these, very large unexpected shifts where entire species of fish could move half an ocean. I'd read how, what were the prospects for a restoration of corals? What's the impact of marine protected areas on juvenile species of different kinds of fish? What's the role of different kinds of specific keystone species within ecosystems? So all of these things kind of was this kind of scientific soil from which I could kind of harvest and use imagination to explore beyond that. And then kind of from that point, I then started to connect these ideas to different sorts of technologies and emerging things that were coming out, because, part of, I guess, my sci-fi nerddom is I'm also very invested and read a lot about emerging technology and, Wired. And I mean, for me, it was kind of being published in Wired, I was like, okay, life achieved. Like, I don't have to do anything else. I was like, I got a PhD, but that's small fry compared to...
That's great, yeah.
Yeah, because it's been something I've read for years, right? Like, I've always...
Yeah.
So, and I think that what was good is that having built that scientific base and sort of training myself to think about sort of trends in that way, reading through it, I then sort of looked at where I was then connecting that to technology and different changes in governance systems and other things, and I could start to kind of, put those things together. And I mean, that was the astonishing thing, right? And that's one of the things I think is valuable about this project, is you can read through, and the point of annotating it like an annotated blog like that is that I don't want people to think that this is so far in the future that they don't have to pay attention. The point of annotating this is to say, this is all stuff that's happening now. As you said, it's these seeds or these weak signals or these triggers of how change might happen. And we can't predict the future, but we have to engage with what's emerging in the present to think about what are all the different alternate futures that might exist. And, and especially because a lot of the speed of technological development is either exponential or approaching exponential, whether it's in terms of artificial intelligence or robotics or synthetic biology. So there's a lot of these things that are happening a lot faster than we can predict. So that's why these stories of kind of showing, putting together those and articulating them in a narrative form is to say that we need to think a lot more deeply about the kind of impacts these things could have on, in this case, on the oceans, but more broadly for humanity, because they're all happening and they're all happening at the same time. They all have cumulative impacts. They all interact with each other, and they all lead to emergent change. So, yeah, so that was why I thought it was important to put all that together.
It also made it so that when you're reading it, you realize, oh my God, it's like a bit of a tunnel. Like you can really get lost in the story by going through and reading these backgrounds. I also noticed some little Easter eggs in there for nerds, like certain anagrams that people might be able to induce by looking. Indeed. Another thing I noticed that I'd want to just ask you about is that you have these 4 stories, and they're all women reporting back. Like one of the stories, The Last Fisherman, is about a man, but it's meant to have been interpreted by his great-great-granddaughter. Was that like something, was there a purpose?
Yeah, I mean, it was deliberate, because one of the things that's difficult about this is that I am a white male from New Zealand living in Sweden. I have my own biases, my own positionality, my own subjectivities. Part of this thinking, part of using science fiction prototyping, part of thinking about the future is forcing you to step outside your own kind of frame of reference and think differently. And so for me, a lot of this was, and had some discussions on this, like why would it necessarily be the same as what it is now? So it was maybe quite a clumsy way, but in a sense it was trying to indicate or to reference the fact that whether it's synthetic biology, governance of the Arctic, or gender norms, there's no reason why that would be the same. And I mean, that's always part of the challenge of reading classic science fiction, right? Like you have the Foundation trilogy, which is series of books by Isaac Asimov where there's these like absolute galactic shattering events and these incredible insights into the historical collapse of human civilization and how you would kind of rebuild it across a galaxy. And yet there's no women. They're essentially completely invisible. They occasionally pop up in the background in order to provide dinner, I think, in one case. It was like, you're thinking like, oh my gosh, you have this massive vision and you can't see what's directly in front of your face, and you still take certain realities to be, immutable. And of course, in these stories, there's going to be blind spots. There's going to be aspects that I've missed and issues around representation that are challenging. But part of it was to try to kind of at least make an honest attempt to say that the future will be different in all ways, and that means that 100% representation of women is something that could, very well be that, and that, and you could have a CEO sort of this absolutely globe-conquering planetary transnational corporation, and that's not something that is like strange or unusual. It's just the way it is. And you could have like an incredibly successful Chinese female academic who is related to a pirate queen. And I have to give good credit to my friend Christina, who's actually she's half Taiwanese and half Austrian, and she spent many years in Hong Kong, and she actually was the one who told me about that, because I was talking with her and trying to get this voice right, and that was so far away from sort of my experience. And then she had this amazing idea. She's like, and then she told me about Xingshi. So that idea really helped me to craft actually that character in a way that was more sort of more authentic.
Beyond experimenting with this particular methodology, Dr. Merrie had two goals for the research project.
On one side, I think that there's a lot of lack of imagination and a lot of problematics in terms of finding enough creative space for policymakers and people who are involved in really big decisions about whether it's the future oceans or a climate policy or something. They're so locked down into their kind of established representative positions of their organization or their country or their whatever it might be, that they don't have the kind of space or openness to really think differently or even think about the implications of the kind of decisions they're making. And so I really saw this project as a way to both experiment with a method where you could actually engage policymakers in a process like science fiction prototyping, where you could actually get them to kind of work in these futures in a way that allowed them to distance themselves from their daily realities and their daily constraints, and they could really embrace a different world and a different character, and maybe that would give them insights and different ideas about the future oceans. Or at the very least, they would look at one of these images and it would spark a different kind of question than they would normally ask. And the other side, the other goal of it was that part of the issue is like being so far into kind of sci-fi and technology, kind of the nerd space, so often it's so detached from the real problems of what's going on and the kind of complex, interlinked, global scale environmental challenges that we're facing. And there's so much creativity and like wonderful goodwill and like potential to kind of tap into these kind of nerd communities to help us save the planet. I mean, I know that sounds a little corny, but it's true. But that's really tricky because often, and this relates to a larger issue in society where we have so much access to so much incredibly high quality media and cultural products, whether it's podcasts or, TV series like Game of Thrones or big budget science fiction movies or whatever it is. The kind of quality and the availability of these for many people, at least in my context and in my life, is huge. So if you really want these nerd communities and indeed broader people to actually care about the oceans and engage in actually the science and actually advocating for them and understanding how it affects their lives, you have to use the same kind of quality and the same kind of media triggers. You can't produce something that's some low quality rubbish kind of picture that goes along with your scientific scenario, because they will not care and no one will engage with it. So part of the reason why I was really happy to get that story in Wired, I mean, apart from me kind of being a fanboy of it, was more that it's like, okay, so you have all this whole tech community who's now exposed to thinking about the oceans. And they go to this story because they see these beautiful pictures, but maybe at the end of it they thought differently and will apply some of their creative effort towards actually addressing these kind of really big societal challenges, and not just thinking that an app can't sort of deal with the fact that the water column is getting warmer and affecting like marine species distributions. So those are the kind of two focal points, I'd say.
He shared the impact of his work with us through a number of stories. From a Swedish member of parliament that uses his sci-fi narratives as a teaching tool for colleagues, to the opportunity he had to present the project to the UN General Assembly at the UN Oceans Conference, where the value of mixing media became very apparent.
I couldn't put the stories there, right? Like, it had to be the images. So images can be so incredibly powerful as a boundary object and an entry point for people to kind of engage with, first the stories and secondly the science. They are themselves like a visual narrative, and so they were so important as an entry point, allowing that to happen.
Of these outreach activities, one perhaps surprising avenue left a particular impression.
We did a Reddit Ask Me Anything about the project, and to be perfectly honest, I think a lot of the reason why people sort of joined in was myself, Patrick Keyes, who is another author on the project, and Simon Stollenhag, who's the artist. And Simon has an incredible following within video games and concept art communities and different things. So he's already very heavily embedded within the nerd community, which is or sort of geekdom, however you want to talk about it. So we did this Reddit Ask Me Anything, and I guess I sort of thought, I think for a lot of scientists, Reddit is like really, really scary. Or for people in general, because often the only time Reddit ever comes in the news is when it's associated with something negative. The fact is, though, that Reddit and a lot of these kind of sub-communities are incredibly passionate, driven, intelligent people who really care about these things and spend hours and hours like seriously engaging with like artworks or ocean science or whatever it is. But what was interesting is when we did this Reddit Ask Me Anything, it was such a mixed audience, but a lot of the people were parts of geekdom, and they were asking like really, really intelligent questions, both about kind of aspects of the science. Many of them had read the stories and were sort of asking questions about very specific things and things that we'd predicted, whether it was or not predicted, but sort of speculated on with a science basis. But it is actually kind of funny, like as an aside, the future is moving so fast. And I mean, we talked about in one of the stories where it's called Rising Tide, where there's sort of burst sea level rise, which leads to, we talk about these Pacific Island communities who then sort of rebuild their civilization under the oceans. I mean, that was based on kind of rapid warming of the West Antarctic ice sheet. And that's happening now. There's been at least 3 papers in top scientific journals in the last 2 years that are talking about accelerated warming and melting of the West Antarctic ice sheet. We put that in there as kind of a bit of an extreme idea. There'd only been one paper, I think, in Science that was sort of talking about it at that point. And all of a sudden, something that was kind of far out there is happening now, and this really points to the value of these kinds of approaches, using imagination, using science fiction, really investing time and energy in thinking about the future, because it helps you to prepare for changes in the present. If you have no tools for being able to think about the future and being uncomfortable and questioning, then you're not going to see things that are right in front of you. You're not going to notice these things that are happening that might be sort of precursors or harbingers of sort of larger scale shifts that are going to radically affect us.
That was Dr. Andrew Merrie. You can find him working in a few capacities at the Stockholm Resilience Centre.
Thanks to Patrick McDowell for recording help. Writing by Cheryl Gladue. Interviews by Tristan Mason and Cheryl Gladue. Also thanks to Patrick Keyes, who brought our attention to radical ocean futures and helped us connect with Andrew Merrie. Music featured in this episode is Are You Well by Bess Fern, Back from the Brink, The Last Fisherman, and Life Underwater by Kayla Luna, and Plans Fall Through by Alexia Avina. Editing by Cheryl Gladue. And of course, the whole thing is powered by Future Earth.